Samuel Wright was an aging black man who had given up his own comfort to raise two abandoned children. He stumbled upon one freezing night. Years later, betrayal from a ruthless boss left him shackled in a courtroom, branded a thief and a liar. The crowd whispering his guilt as the judge prepared to condemn him to life behind bars. But just as the gavel hovered in the air, two unexpected figures rose, and the truth they carried silenced the entire room. Before we dive deeper, if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe. Your support helps us share stories that matter. Stay with us until the very end, and if this story moves you, leave a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. That winter carried a cold that crept into bones and lingered in the smoke-filled streets of a tired factory town. Samuel Wright, a weary man in his late 50s, dragged a limp that never healed from decades of labor. His boss often sneered that he was slow, useless, barely worth the paycheck. Samuel never argued. He endured the insults, clenched his jaw, and carried on. One night, as he passed the narrow alley behind a diner, the rattle of freezer fans mixed with the bite of the wind. There, huddled against a dumpster, were two children, skin pale, shivering under rags that barely covered them. The older boy's arm wrapped around his sister, holding her close, trying to shield her from the cold. Samuel paused. He could have walked past like the rest of the town. His boss's words echoed, "Don't waste your time on strays. You can barely feed yourself." And it was true. Samuel's dinners were often scraps. His room never truly warm. But when he looked at those children, something stirred deeper than his own hunger. He bent down, his knees groaning, and the children lifted their eyes that had seen too much too soon. "You two got a place to go?" he asked gently. No words, only a slow shake of their heads. Samuel sighed, his breath hanging in the frozen air. He knew too well what it meant to be discarded, forgotten. He couldn't let it happen to them. "Not tonight," he said quietly, extending his rough, calloused hand. The boy hesitated, but the little girl slipped her tiny fingers into his palm, cold as ice, but trusting. That was enough. By the time Samuel guided them to his small apartment, neighbors peeked through cracked doors, whispering, "That old fool." A voice sneered from the stairwell. "Man can't even keep his own lights on. Now he's feeding strays." Another woman chuckled, shaking her head. "He'll drown right alongside them." Samuel heard. He always heard. But he kept his head down and walked on, two fragile lives trailing behind him. His apartment was no sanctuary. Walls stained with years of peeling paint, a couch sagging in the middle, and a heater that rattled more than it warmed. Still, Samuel spread blankets across the couch, warmed a thin pot of broth, and watched the children devour it like they hadn't eaten in days. That night, rubbing his aching leg in the corner, Samuel thought about the mocking he'd face at work, the bills that would stretch thinner than ever. Yet, he also knew this. Those children would not be left to freeze on the concrete again. Not while he had breath in his body. In that quiet decision, a bond was sealed, one that would outlast every insult, every hardship. The days that followed bit hard. Samuel worked the steel factory floor, where the air reeked of molten iron, and every crash of machinery rattled his bones. His boss, Mr. Dalton, lived to humiliate him. He waited until the room hushed, then barked across the hall. "Right. Even those orphans you dragged home could outpace you." Laughter erupted, some uneasy, some eager to join in. Samuel never fired back. He simply wiped the sweat from his brow and carried on, his limp growing heavier with each step. But at night, the weight lifted. He'd open the crooked door to his apartment, and two voices would greet him. The boy, Eli, always clutching a book, reading aloud with pride from lessons at school. His little sister, Grace, sitting at the wobbling table, sketching with a pencil worn to the nub, her drawings filled with houses brighter and warmer than anything they'd ever known. Samuel skipped meals so their plates stayed full. He stitched Ellie's jacket with clumsy hands, saved loose coins for Grace's shoes, and on nights when the heater sputtered and died, he gathered them close, pretending his shivers were nothing. The neighbors gossiped still, in stairwells, on corners, behind closed doors. "He'll end up broke with those kids," one muttered. "He's already finished." Another smirked as Samuel passed. But Samuel never looked their way. He just tightened his coat, held his head steady, and walked home to the only family he had. A black man raising two white kids. "Just wait. One day, they'll turn on him." The words stung, but Samuel never replied. Instead, he poured everything he had into Eli and Grace. He taught Eli how to change a tire, how to look a man in the eye, and shake his hand with pride. He showed Grace how to count coins, how to walk tall when the world tried to make her small. Mr. Dalton never let him forget his place. When Samuel asked for a day off to take Grace to the clinic, Dalton sneered, "You're not their father. Stop pretending you're some kind of hero." But Samuel went anyway, holding Grace's hand as they walked to the doctor, knowing the wages he'd lose. That night, when Dalton cut his pay in half, Samuel slipped the stub into his pocket and smiled as if nothing had changed. The years stacked with sacrifice. Eli grew sharp, his mind quick as steel, earning scholarships Dalton swore he'd never see. Grace, once the timid girl with stubby pencils, became a fearless voice in debates, unafraid to defend her strange little family. Samuel's limp grew worse. His back stooped, his hands like stone from decades of work. But the children stood taller every day. For the first time, he let himself believe. Maybe kindness wasn't wasted. Maybe it grew roots deeper than hate. But Dalton had been watching too, and with each passing year, his bitterness festered. Seeing Samuel walk with his head a little higher, hearing talk of those orphans making something of themselves, it gnawed at him. To Dalton, it was proof that Samuel had stolen dignity he never deserved. One gray autumn morning, the trap snapped shut. Samuel came home, weary from the factory, to find two policemen waiting at his door. Their uniforms pressed sharp, their eyes cold. From her window across the street, a neighbor muttered, "Told you so. Always knew he'd land in trouble." The words slithered from a neighbor's lips as two officers pushed past Samuel, tearing through his worn-down apartment. From beneath the sagging couch cushion, they yanked out a bag stuffed with cash and factory-stamped equipment. Samuel froze. He had never seen it before. Within hours, cold steel bit into his wrists. At the factory gates, Dalton stood with arms crossed, smirking as Samuel was marched away. "Guess kindness doesn't pay," he sneered, loud enough for the workers. Some chuckled, others looked down, unwilling to meet Samuel's eyes. The courtroom reeked of varnish and old wood. Samuel sat hunched at the defendant's table, shoulders heavy, years of labor weighing him down. The prosecutor painted him as a bitter man who stole to survive. Witnesses, workers Dalton had quietly bought, swore they'd seen Samuel sneaking through storage rooms. The gallery murmured, knew he was too good to be true. Even those kids he raised probably don't know the real him. Samuel's mouth stayed closed. He wanted to roar his innocence, but decades of swallowing insults had carved silence into his bones. His thoughts drifted to Eli and Grace, but he refused to drag them into this humiliation. Better they stay away. Better they never see him like this. The judge's gavel struck. The words "life sentence" rang in Samuel's ears. The room seemed to collapse inward. The walls squeezed tight. Breath grew thin. His eyes sank to the floor, and a bitter truth gnawed at him. Maybe Dalton was right. Maybe a man like him was never meant to rise above his place. Then the back doors creaked open. Two figures strode in, calm, unshaken, eyes locked on the man at the defendant's table. Eli, Grace. No longer the trembling children he'd once led from an alley, but adults sharpened by the very sacrifices he thought no one had noticed. The gallery stirred, whispers rising into gasps. Dalton's smirk faltered. Samuel's chest clenched. He hadn't wanted them to see him broken, but as Eli dropped a thick stack of legal files onto the defense table and Grace raised a recorder, scanning the room with fire in her eyes, Samuel understood something he'd never dared believe. His kindness had not been wasted. The buzz in the courtroom swelled as Eli straightened his tie, shoulders square, voice strong. Gone was the timid boy who once hid behind shadows. He stood tall now, declaring himself Samuel's attorney, slamming the evidence onto the table, every page a weapon. Grace settled into the gallery, her recorder blinking red. She wasn't there as a bystander. She was there as a journalist, documenting every second. Her pen had already rattled powerful men, and now her focus was fixed on Dalton. The prosecution tried to push forward, but Eli dismantled their case one thread at a time. Witnesses who swore they'd seen Samuel steal faltered under his sharp questions. One broke, admitting he'd only heard rumors. Another tangled himself in contradictions. Eli exposed the lies with precision, stripping away Dalton's scheme piece by piece. Then came the blow that shook the room. Grace stood, asking permission to submit a report. Inside was a record of Dalton's wage theft, harassment, and falsified accounts, evidence she had uncovered through her investigations. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Dalton's face reddened, fists clenched white. Samuel sat motionless, eyes stinging. He had believed the children he raised had long since outgrown him, stepped into lives beyond his reach. But here they stood, fighting with the fire he had unknowingly lit within them. The judge leaned back, tapping a pen as the courtroom buzzed. Finally, his voice cut through. It appears this case was built on lies and manipulation. His gaze swept from Samuel to Dalton. The charges are dismissed. Gasps filled the air. Some clapped. Others jeered as Dalton stormed out in defeat. Eli placed a steady hand on Samuel's shoulder. Grace moved beside him, her voice soft but unshaken. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Dad." That single word, Dad, rang louder than the gavel that freed him. The neighbors who once mocked fell silent. Reporters scribbled furiously. And Samuel, worn and weary, finally straightened his back and lifted his eyes. He had once pulled 2 children from the cold. 20 years later, they had pulled him from a cage. Because kindness never dies. It waits, it grows, and when the time is right, it saves. When Samuel chose compassion decades earlier, he never dreamed it would return to save his life. This story is a reminder that every act of kindness plants a seed that can one day bloom into salvation. If this story moved you, subscribe now and stay with us for the next one. You won't want to miss what comes next.